When we think about a time machine, we usually picture something straight out of a science fiction novel, like a pod with blinking lights, or a keypad where you punch in the exact year you want to visit, maybe some spinning gears.
Right, yeah. It is always framed as a machine built by some brilliant, eccentric scientist in a glowing laboratory.
Exactly. We tend to think of time travel as this highly engineered, incredibly intentional act. But what if the ultimate time machine isn't a machine at all? What if, instead, it's a terrifying, catastrophic natural disaster?
Oh, absolutely.
Step into a pod, the earth just opens up beneath your feet and instantly seals an entire thriving city in a perfect, oxygen-depleted vault for 3 centuries. Today, our mission on this deep dive is to pry open one of those natural time capsules.
And we have a massive stack of sources to go through for this. I mean, everything from the original diver logs recorded by marine archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s to highly technical metallurgical assays from modern conservation labs.
Yeah, all the way back to original 17th century colonial records.
Right. And we're using those sources to reconstruct the fate of Port Royal, Jamaica. In the late 17th century, this place was widely known as the storehouse and treasury of the West Indies.
It was also famously dubbed the wickedest city in the world.
Which is quite a title.
It really is. It was a city of extreme, baffling contradictions. You had unparalleled wealth, hordes of privateers, bustling taverns, brothels, and a massive concentration of wealthy merchants, all crammed shoulder to shoulder onto this tiny spit of land in the Caribbean.
It was absolutely wild to consider is that this city only existed for about 37 years.
Wow. Just a complete flash in the pan.
Exactly. But because of what happened on one specific sunny morning in 1692, it literally vanished in a matter of minutes.
And by vanishing, it left behind an incredible collection of silver and pewter items that acts as a flawless, unmixed window into the past. So we are going to zoom in on those specific metal artifacts today and explore how a devastating earthquake acted as a bizarre, perfect preservation mechanism.
The value of this site for understanding colonial history really cannot be overstated. We aren't looking at gradual decay or the slow abandonment of a settlement over decades. We are looking at a literal freeze frame of a society at the absolute height of its chaotic wealth.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
But to understand how those silver and pewter items survived, we have to understand the mechanics of the disaster itself. So picture the scene. It is the morning of Tuesday, June 7, 1692. The city is awake, the taverns are already busy, the merchants are trading.
Right, just a normal day.
It's just normal Tuesday. And then at roughly 11:43 a.m., the earth beneath Port Royal simply gives way. Modern seismologists studying the historical accounts estimate the city was hit by 3 violent earthquake shockwaves in rapid succession.
Probably around a 7.5 on the Richter scale.
Yeah.
The sheer force of the shaking was devastating, of course, but the shaking wasn't actually the primary reason the city sank into the sea.
It was.
No, the real culprit was the very ground the city was built upon. Port Royal was incredibly dense. The residents had crammed about 2,000 buildings, and many of these were heavy, 2-story brick structures built in the English style.
Right.
They crammed all of that onto just 51 acres of land.
And all of that massive, crushing weight was sitting on loose sand and a really high water table.
That combination of immense top weight and water-saturated ground is what triggers a very specific, terrifying geological phenomenon called liquefaction.
Right, and the physics behind liquefaction described in the sources are fascinating because it's not the cinematic earthquake you see in movies where the ground splits open into a giant bottomless canyon and swallows a city whole.
No, not at all. Liquefaction is much more insidious.
Yeah.
When you introduce intense, rapid shaking to loose, wet sand, the water pressure between the individual grains of sand increases dramatically. The physical shading forces the water upward. And eventually, those sand particles completely lose physical contact with each other.
Okay, wow.
They become suspended in the water. So in an instant, they stop acting like a solid weight-bearing foundation and start behaving almost exactly like a fluid.
It is basically turning solid ground into instant quicksand. I like to think of it like, well, if you take a bucket filled to the brim with wet sand, let it settle, and then place a heavy rock on top, the rock just sits there safely.
Right.
But if you start vibrating that bucket violently, hitting the sides, the water pressure forces the grains apart. Suddenly, your solid foundation is a liquid, and that heavy rock sinks straight to the bottom.
That is exactly what happened to Port Royal. Many of these massive brick buildings didn't topple over or shatter into a million pieces. They just sank, almost perfectly vertically right into the earth.
Just remaining entirely intact as the sand swallowed them.
Yes. And that vertical sinking is precisely why the archaeological record in Kingston Harbor is so unprecedented.
How so?
Well, in normal terrestrial archaeology, researchers deal with layers of history stacked on top of each other. A building is constructed, lived in, renovated, maybe it burns down, it gets rebuilt.
Later, it's used as a trash dump.
Exactly. And eventually paved over by a modern parking lot. So the artifacts from different eras get entirely mixed up. But Port Royal is what archaeologists call a catastrophic site. It is frozen exactly as it was on that Tuesday morning.
The earthquake stops, the violent shaking ends, and the water pressure drops, allowing the ground to solidify again. But the geography is forever changed. 2/3 of the city is now completely underwater.
With thousands of people tragically trapped in the newly hardened sand.
Yeah, which is followed almost immediately by a massive sweeping tsunami. It is undeniably the absolute worst day in the city's history. Yet, the very mechanics of this nightmare created an underwater vault, which, it feels like a total paradox.
It does.
Normally, we think of the ocean as the ultimate enemy of preservation, especially when it comes to metals.
Oh, absolutely. We have all seen footage of shipwrecks in the ocean. The expectation is rust, rampant decay, wood-boring shipworms destroying the timber.
Right. Metal disintegrating into absolute nothingness over the centuries. If you drop a pristine silver coin or a shiny pewter plate into the Caribbean Sea, you fully expect the aggressive saltwater to eat it alive over the course of 300 years.
You'd think so, yes.
So why didn't it? Why did divers like Edwin Link in the 20th century pull up 17th century pewter plates that look like they were cast yesterday?
It all comes down to the microscopic science of the silt. Because of the liquefaction we just discussed, these buildings and all the silver and pewter inside them didn't just casually fall into the water to rest on the seafloor.
Right.
They sank directly and violently into the hot, dense bottom sediment of the harbor. That rapid, suffocating burial is the entire key to their survival. It immediately created an anaerobic environment.
So the mud packed so tightly around the objects that it completely sealed out the oxygenated open water above.
Yes. Oxygen is the crucial catalyst for most forms of decay and corrosion, especially the oxidation process that destroys metal in a marine environment.
Oh, I see.
When the harbor's sand and mud instantly packed around these items, it formed a protective, oxygen-depleted shell. It also protected the artifacts from roaming marine life, corrosive ocean currents, and the physical battering of tropical storms.
Wow.
This suffocating burial protected the pewter and silver infinitely better than a typical shipwreck in the Western Hemisphere, where items are just left exposed and vulnerable on the open seafloor.
Wait, I need to stop you there because the mechanics of the recovery process sound entirely counterintuitive to me.
Okay, how so?
Well, you have a fragile 300-year-old pewter plate that has been buried in wet mud. When a diver finally swims down, clears away the silt, and pulls that tankard out of the harbor, is it just ready to go on a museum shelf?
Oh, definitely not. Bringing it to the surface is only the very beginning of the battle. While the anaerobic environment prevented the items from rusting away to nothing, the objects have spent centuries absorbing the ocean.
Okay.
They are deeply, thoroughly saturated with marine chlorides, which are salts.
So they have just been marinating in a corrosive, salty soup since 1692.
Exactly. If you take a porous iron or pewter artifact out of that protective marine environment and just let it sit on a desk in the open air, a violent chemical reaction begins.
Oh, no.
The moisture and oxygen in the modern air react aggressively with those embedded chlorides. The artifact will literally begin to sweat acidic salt water.
Wait, really? It just sweats?
Yes, it will flake, crack, and eventually crumble to dust from the inside out. The object destroys itself simply by being exposed to the air we breathe.
That is genuinely heartbreaking to think about. Imagine the effort of locating a sunken city, saving a priceless piece of history from the bottom of the ocean, just to watch it turn to a pile of powder in your hands.
It is. And this is where modern conservation labs, like the one at Ships of Discovery highlighted in our sources, become the real heroes of the story.
Yeah, what do they do?
They utilize a process called electrolysis to save these metals. They place the saturated artifact in a chemical bath and pass a very specific low electrical current through it. The current essentially forces the negative chloride ions out of the metal's pores and into the surrounding liquid.
Now, here's where I want to push back on the science of this because it sounds crazy.
Okay.
You're telling me we have a delicate metal artifact that is already highly unstable. Your solution is to submerge it in more liquid and run an electrical current through it.
Yes.
How does electrocuting a fragile piece of 17th century pewter not just melt it or blow it apart?
It is a brilliant question, and it is exactly what early conservators struggled with. The assumption was that you needed a strong current to blast the salts out quickly.
Right, that makes sense.
But the sources note that conservationists had to run extensive experiments because the old assumptions were actively damaging the artifacts. They discovered that less is more. The process requires an incredibly low, gentle voltage.
Okay, so a very low current.
Right. The goal isn't to heat the metal. The goal is to create a slow, steady migration of ions.
So it is a meticulous, microscopic coaxing of the salt out of the metal rather than a brute force shock.
It is an agonizingly delicate, painstaking process. Depending on the physical density of the metal and just how severely saturated it is with chlorides, that gentle electrolysis can take hours or it can take years for a single, complex object to be fully stabilized.
Years for one object.
Yes. Only after the chemical bath runs clear of chlorides is the item finally safe to be handled, dried, and studied in the open air.
That painstaking electrolysis process is the only reason we have access to the actual data hidden in these objects. Because when divers finally started pulling these stabilized items out of the conservation baths, the sheer volume of silver and pewter recovered was breathtaking.
It officially stands as the world's most significant collection of 17th century pewter. And the sheer variety of the items gives us a microscopic, unfiltered look at the daily life of this notorious city.
And one specific artifact stands out above everything else recovered, acting practically as the mascot of the Port Royal excavations.
Oh, a watch.
Yes, the watch. It is a brass-cased pocket watch made by a Frenchman named Paul Blondel, dating back to 1686. When the explorer Edwin Link found this in the underwater ruins in the late 1950s, it was totally encased in a thick crust of marine growth and coral.
They couldn't even see the face of the watch.
Oh, right. But when they took it to a lab and put it under an X-ray machine to peer through the crust, they saw the delicate metal hands inside.
And the hands were frozen in place.
Frozen at exactly 11.43. I cannot get over the sheer poetry of that detail. Up until that X-ray was taken, it was the very first time in the history of global archaeology that the exact minute of a natural disaster was pinpointed by a single physical artifact. The universe quite literally hit the pause button on this watch as the city sank.
It is the ultimate timekeeper of a catastrophe. And while the watch provides us with the precise scientific timeline of the event, the other recovered artifacts give us the actual flavor of the city, quite literally in some cases.
Oh, you are talking about the Edwin Link taste test?
Yes, I am.
This is one of my absolute favorite details from the diver logs. Link actually found an intact, tightly corked glass bottle buried in the 1692 sediment. Because he was apparently an incredibly brave, or perhaps foolish man, he used a hypodermic needle to pierce the cork, extract some of the cloudy yellow fluid inside, and actually tasted it.
Which is wild.
And his official review in the logs, horrible. Tastes like strongly salted vinegar. He joked to his crew that 1692 was a remarkably bad vintage year.
It is a visceral way to connect with the past, even if it is a bit reckless. But moving beyond the preserved bottles, the pewter haul is astonishing in its hyper-specificity. The archaeologists weren't just finding stacks of basic utilitarian plates. The divers recovered specialized medical syringes, baluster measures used by bartenders for pouring exact increments of alcohol, and even a delicate sundial that someone had saved as scrap metal to be melted down later.
There is a pewter tankard they recovered that has a thumb piece on the lid shaped like either a wild Maine boy or Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. Which, I mean, it feels incredibly fitting for a town globally infamous for its drinking culture and taverns.
Very fitting.
But the artifacts that really stopped me in my tracks were the spoons.
Ah, yes. The coronation spoons offer a profound insight into their society.
Divers found beautiful pewter spoons cast with the detailed busts of King William III and Queen Mary II. William and Mary were officially crowned in London in 1689.
Right.
The earthquake obliterated Port Royal in 1692. That is a maximum of a 3-year turnaround from a royal event in England to a commemorative spoon being dropped in the mud in Jamaica. To me, that is the 17th century equivalent of finding a modern shipwreck and realizing every single person on board is walking around holding the absolute newest, just-released smartphone.
That is a perfect analogy for understanding the cultural dynamic at play. Finding those specific spoons completely shatters the historical myth of Port Royal as an isolated, uncultured pirate backwater.
You usually picture these pirates marooned on a tropical island, drinking out of old wooden cups, and completely cut off from civilization. But these spoons prove the residents of Port Royal were highly connected global citizens.
Oh, completely.
They had immediate, demanding access to the absolute latest trends coming out of London. They were active consumers of pop culture.
And this brings us to the deeper structural layer of our deep dives today. These objects are beautiful to look at, and the preservation science is remarkable, but they're ultimately vital data points. The metals tell us a complex, hidden story about the underlying socioeconomic code of this wicked city.
Let's transition from pop culture to hard economics then. What do these metals tell us when we look specifically at the silver?
Well, the historical sources emphasize an enormous abundance of silver coins found throughout the ruins, specifically Spanish pieces of 8.
Wait, but Jamaica was a fiercely British colony?
It was.
So why is the ground practically paved with Spanish silver? Were they just running a robust trade business with the neighboring Spanish islands?
They were certainly involved in a robust exchange of goods, but trade is perhaps too polite a word.
Oh.
They were acquiring this silver in a very specific, aggressive manner. Port Royal served as the primary beating heart for Spanish bullion entering the English imperial system, and this massive influx of wealth was fueled almost entirely by privateering.
Privateering being the polite legal term for state-sanctioned piracy.
Precisely. The English colonial governors in Jamaica essentially issued official letters of marque to notorious captains like Henry Morgan.
Right, the famous Captain Morgan.
Yes. These letters made it perfectly legal under English law to attack Spanish commercial ships and coastal settlements, confiscate their silver, and bring the plunder back to Port Royal to spend freely in the local taverns, brothels, and markets. The overwhelming abundance of those specific Spanish coins in the archaeological record maps perfectly onto the historical reality of how the city generated its staggering wealth. It was the thriving economy built fundamentally on legalized violent plunder.
But the economy wasn't just based on stealing things from other ships. And this is the ultimate aha moment of the entire deep dive for me. The proof of their real sophistication is hidden right on the bottom of the pewter plates.
The maker's marks.
Yes. When you flip a 17th century pewter plate over, you often find maker's marks stamped into the metal little symbols acting as a craftsman's signature or a guild classification.
Right.
The archaeologists found plenty of marks from a man named John Luke, who is a known English importer. That makes total sense. The wealthy merchants are buying finished, fancy plates shipped over from England, but then they started finding a massive amount of marks belonging to a man named Simon Benning.
The discovery of Simon Benning's marks is the key that unlocks a completely new historical understanding of Port Royal.
Because Simon Benning wasn't sitting in a workshop in London. He was a local pewterer, living, working, and operating his own foundry right there in the streets of Port Royal.
He was on the island.
Right. He wasn't just importing finished luxury plates from the homeland. He was importing raw, heavy tin ingots and actually casting the custom pewter flatware right there.
Which is a profound revelation for historians. If we connect this local manufacturing to the bigger picture of colonial economics, it proves definitively that Port Royal possessed a highly mature, self-sustaining economy.
How so?
Well, you simply do not have local master craftsmen importing raw materials, setting up foundries, and manufacturing custom luxury goods on site unless you have a highly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy consumer base living there to demand that custom work.
I see.
It elevates Port Royal from a temporary, chaotic pirate haven to a heavily industrialized, permanent colonial powerhouse.
They weren't just surviving on the edge of the empire. They were manufacturing their own goods. They were building an independent economic empire of their own in the Caribbean. But we only have the physical proof of that sophistication because the 1692 earthquake violently sealed Benning's workshop in the anaerobic mud.
Exactly. And the power of that preserved evidence becomes even more stark when archaeologists analyze the subsequent layers of sediment deposited in the harbor after the 1692 earthquake.
Because Port Royal didn't completely disappear overnight, right?
Oh, a fraction of the survivors stayed and desperately tried to rebuild on the remaining land. But the weakened city was then hit by a devastating fire in 1703, followed by massive city-leveling hurricanes in 1712, 1722, and beyond.
It feels like the universe was just absolutely determined to wipe the specific place off the map, no matter what it took.
The geological and meteorological record certainly makes it seem that way. But when you examine the metal artifacts recovered from those later 18th century archaeological layers, there is a distinct, measurable shift in the data.
What changed?
The high-status, customized private pewter. The exact kind of artisanal work Simon Benning was casting locally completely starts to disappear from the record. It is rapidly replaced by standardized, boring, mass-produced naval issue items.
Wow. So you can literally read the tragic decline of the city's entire culture in the metal itself.
Yes.
You go from finding custom Bacchus tankards and fresh coronation spoons to unearthing generic, stamped military rations. It perfectly maps the city's fall from this vibrant, wicked, independent mercantile capital to just a strategic, quiet, highly regulated British naval outpost.
The metal artifacts silently track the death of the city's independent soul, decades after the earthquake took its physical body.
That is incredibly poetic. I want to pull all of these threads together for you listening. We started with a wildly wealthy city, built foolishly on a foundation of loose sand, fueled by a chaotic mix of Spanish silver and aggressive privateering.
Right.
In a matter of minutes, the physics of liquefaction swallowed it whole. But by sinking vertically into that hot, dense mud, the city was perfectly sealed in an oxygen-depleted marine vault.
Preserved forever.
Because of that terrifying, suffocating burial and the painstaking modern science of electrolysis, the silver and pewter survived to tell the tale. Those metals gave us the exact 11.43 timestamp, the culturally connected William and Mary spoons, and the absolute proof of an independent local industry run by masters like Simon Benning. It completely rewrote our modern understanding of colonial Caribbean life.
It fundamentally shifted the historical paradigm. But there's a really fascinating paradox here that the sources point out.
Oh, what is it?
Port Royal's reputation as the dazzling, wicked storehouse of the West Indies is legendary only because it was destroyed.
Wait, really?
Think about it. If the earthquake hadn't catastrophically sealed the city in 1692, it likely would have naturally declined through the subsequent fires and hurricanes anyway. Its beautiful pewter would have been melted down for scrap or replaced by that standardized naval gear over time.
Oh, wow. I never thought of that.
In a strange twist of fate, the absolute worst day in Port Royal's history was the exact thing that granted it archaeological immortality.
We spend a lot of time on this show looking back at the legacy of the past, but the story of Port Royal's preservation always makes me turn that lens on our own present day. Think about it. If the ground beneath your city underwent rapid liquefaction tomorrow and your entire neighborhood was catastrophically swallowed by anaerobic mud, what would survive?
It's a sobering thought.
What mundane, everyday objects, what modern equivalents of Simon Benning's pewter plates would future archaeologists uncover after 300 years of electrolysis? Would they find beautiful, custom expressions of our local culture perfectly preserved? Or would they just find millions of standardized, mass-produced plastic phone cases defining who we were?
Right.
It's a fascinating lens to view our own daily lives through. You don't need a glowing machine with blinking lights to travel back in time. You just need the ground to turn to liquid and the mud to seal out the oxygen. The catastrophe itself is the time machine. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey to the bottom of Kingston Harbor. We will catch you on the next deep dive.